The Observer.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Alexi Mostrous. I'm investigations editor at The Observer. Still feels a bit weird saying that. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here tonight, both in our newsroom and to those joining online for this latest gathering of the Observer Book Club. We're trying to create a space where the spirit of journalism meets the power of literature. And tonight we're joined by someone whose work truly embodies that mission, Laura Bates. Laura is a multi-award winning... Yeah, clap. Laura is a multi-award winning author, founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, and a tireless campaigner for gender equality. Her new book, The New Age of Sexism, is a terrifying wake-up call, which exposes how sexism is mutating in our digital world. This evening, we'll unpack some of the ideas in the book and hear firsthand about some of the reporting, the extraordinary reporting that Laura did, including visiting a German cyber brothel. Before we dive in, a quick reminder about something a former editor of The Observer said, which is that journalism is much too interesting and important to be left to journalists. So we really want to hear from you tonight as well. Your voices really matter. If you have a question or a thought during this discussion, just raise your hand or catch my eye, and I'll make sure that someone comes to you with a mic. We'd really like to hear from you. But Laura, welcome.
Thank you.
Can we start, please, with the central premise of your book, that we're entering into a new age of misogyny driven by technology and AI. Can you just take us inside that new age? What does it look like?
Sure. So the misogyny, of course, isn't new, but the technology is. And the risk is that we are entering a new world where these various different forms of technology will be so embedded, so inextricably embedded in our day-to-day life that it will be almost impossible to disentangle ourselves from them, which is why it's so important to act now, why there is this moment of urgency. I mean, social media is a very useful kind of microcosmic example of what we're about to see. If you think about the early days of social media, when it seemed like a fad or a kind of interesting tool that you could take or leave, voices were raised in warning, particularly the voices of Black women, who are always the canaries in the coal mines. That this was in many ways unethical, that it was unequal, that it was not a safe environment for all its users. And of course, they were ignored. If you look at the situation we are in now, social media is, for many of us, inescapable, not just because it's so embedded in our social and our even romantic lives, but because for so many of us, there is no escaping it in terms of our work, in terms of our career. We need to use it. We have to be involved with it because it's the way that so many people get their news, because it's actually become so central in many ways to democracy and how politics is conducted. So there's a point at which now social media is so widely used, so embedded and frankly so profitable that at this point it has proved almost impossible to persuade the people who control and profit from it to be prepared to make the kind of foundational root and branch changes that we would need to see for it to become equitable, for it to be a space that women could use in their day-to-day lives and careers without facing a barrage of misogyny and rape threats and death threats as a result. So what we are about to see is a similar kind of transition in terms of that on a scale of 1 million. And this is something that's already happening, but this time it won't be something we can choose to step outside of or log off. For example, if you go for a job tomorrow and you decide to search for that job, then even the ads, the algorithms that are used to decide which ads should pop up are much more likely to display high-profile corporate well-paid jobs to male job seekers than they are to women. Let's say you decide to send off your CV and apply for one of those jobs. 40% already of UK companies are using algorithms, are using AI within their recruitment processes that helps them to determine who they should invite for interview. And it sounds great, as a lot of the AI speak does, right? It's all about innovation, it's all about progress and efficiency. And you can see how to a company that sounds really appealing, right? You've got 3,000 applicants, we'll whittle it down to the best 50. We won't just get the best candidates, but the best one suited for your company. And it sounds really appealing. The problem is in how it's done and what the outcomes are. So what they'll do is look at your company and see who's going to be most appealing comparing to who has been successful in achieving jobs at this company before. So it's going to start looking for white, privately educated men, probably, in a country where there are almost 3 times as many men named John running FTSE 100 companies as all the women put together. And even if you say, well, okay, we're going to switch off the race and the gender, so it will be race and gender blind, it can't possibly discriminate, which again sounds great on paper. What the algorithm will then do is it will start discriminating by proxy. It'll start looking for words like netball and realizing that it doesn't crop up on many of the CVs of the people who've been successful at going for jobs at this company before, or historically black colleges in the US. So this is something that will start to encroach, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in recruitment, whether it's in global financial services, on every area of our lives. And we have to pay attention now before it's too late to prevent that inequality from being re-embedded and amplified in that future world.
I mean, most of your book is concerned with technology and AI and violence perpetrated against women. But it's so interesting that you mention other forms of discrimination. And I just wanted to ask you, in terms of where we are now, do you think that AI discrimination and the way that AI treats women and men differently today, is it worse, or is it just different to human-based misogyny? So if you went for a job as a woman today and you faced a human across a table, which would you prefer, or are they both as bad as each other?
That's such a good question. I mean, it's a question of scale. So if you have AI that is discriminatory, that is probably going to have a bigger impact than individual humans who would be bringing their own bias to bear on the decisions that they're making, because we know that there are humans who aren't necessarily behaving in that way. But it's also about the fact that AI doesn't just re-roll out and kind of vomit back at us, regurgitate our existing misogyny. It's actually programmed to amplify it. So if we stay with this idea for the moment of things that aren't kind of explicitly misogynistic, even things which seem like really powerful, positive, neutral tools have that impact. So a great example of this is generative AI, which of course is having a huge moment. In 2023 alone, $21.3 billion were invested in it globally. We know that ChatGPT has 100 million weekly users already, so this is quite significant in terms of uptake. But what we're seeing is that what those algorithms are trained to do, what the programs are trained to do, is essentially to ingest vast data sets, vast amounts of information, and use them to guess the most likely thing that you are looking for in the response that it gives you. So we know, for example, from a UNESCO study that generative AI repeatedly doesn't just spit back gendered, heavily gendered and racist assumptions and stereotypes about people, but actually amplifies them. If you go to a generative picture model and you ask it to give you a picture of a kitten 100 times, it will give you 100 different fluffy, cute kittens, but it's never ever going to provide you with a kitten that's a hairless Sphinx cat. And the reason for that is because it's going to look at that in its data set and realize that it's an outlier. And therefore, on balance of probability, it's probably not what you were hoping for when you asked for that. So you can see how it is explicitly designed to exclude outliers, and in so doing is going to end up amplifying and sharpening existing bias, which of course isn't a catastrophe for the hairless Sphinx cat, but it does become a problem when we're thinking about the fact that by the end of this year, it's estimated that 30% of outbound marketing content will be generatively created. And you start thinking about the strides that we fought for in terms of diversity in marketing and so on, in terms of, for example, it presenting you with an image of a model that it will universally assume as a very thin, white-skinned, very, very young, non-disabled woman, and so on. So it adds up and it concentrates the existing misogyny, I would say.
I mean, many people are familiar with your background, Laura. The Everyday Sexism project was so phenomenally successful and is still going. But can you give, before we get really into the book, can you give us a short idea of like how you got into this project and what kind of drove you in terms of your own personal experiences?
Yeah, I started the Everyday Sexism project about 12 years ago after having a really bad week. I was literally just that. I was living in London and I was followed home by a man who really wouldn't take no for an answer. He was propositioning me increasingly explicitly, and in the end, when I asked him to leave me alone, said that he would follow me home and always know where I lived. And I didn't know really what to do, and ended up stopping off and texting a male friend who came to the shop I was waiting in. And of course, at that point, the man quickly moved away. And a few nights later, I was on the bus on my way home quite late in the evening when a man sat down next to me and with no warning put his hand between my legs and grabbed me and touched me. And I panicked and froze, which we know is a completely normal response in a situation like that. Moved away eventually and happened to be on my phone to my mum at the time and blurted it out. I don't think I'd been brave enough to say it out loud if I hadn't been on the phone. But because I was, I said, "Mum, I'm on the bus and this guy just groped me." And I didn't use the term sexual assault because at the time, living in this society, I had no sense that that was what it was. And everybody on the bus heard, and everybody looked out the window. Nobody said a word, nobody stepped in, but it was more than that. Nobody even made eye contact with me. It felt like a strong message. We don't want to hear this. This is your problem to deal with. This is just the way things are. Don't make a fuss. So I didn't. I got off the bus at the next stop, walked the rest of the way home and never told anybody else what had happened. And a few days later, I was walking down the street in broad daylight when some guys just started talking about pieces of my body and things that they would like to do to me. And suddenly at the end of that week, when I sat down and thought about these experiences, it hit me that if they hadn't all happened in the same week, I don't think I would have thought twice about any one of those things because I was so used to it. It was so normal. And I started talking to other women and girls, expecting that a few of them might have a story to tell me. And instead it was every single woman I spoke to, and not just one story from a few years ago, but yeah, on my way to meet you just now, this happened yesterday at work. How long have you got? And it was that realization, I think, of the sheer scale of this and the severity of it, alongside the fact that so many men, when I tried to talk about it, were telling me sexism doesn't exist anymore. Women are equal now, more or less. That prompted me to want to not necessarily fix the problem, but at least force people into seeing it. And that was how the Everyday Sexism Project was born.
And one of the things that I found powerful and surprising about the book were these very kind of persuasive accounts that the reactions of women when they are faced with online and digital sexual violence are similar to the sort of reactions that you and other women have experienced when you are faced with physical violence.
Yeah, and I mean, as somebody who has experienced both, it's bizarre to me that as a society, we can all completely get on board with the fact that when you see a zombie slasher movie, you panic and your heart races and you sweat. And maybe later on that night, when you hear a noise in the darkness of your bedroom, you jump out of your skin. None of that as a society is controversial. But the idea that women who experience sexual harassment and abuse in virtual spaces, often increasingly realistic virtual spaces like the metaverse, should have any kind of reaction to it at all continues to be met with ridicule, despite the fact that last year UK police said they were investigating the virtual gang rape of a girl under the age of 16 in the metaverse, and that she had experienced similar psychological effects to those of someone who had experienced a real life form of abuse. But I also think it's fascinating that people are so determined to compare these two things, as if they can trick us into admitting that they're not identical, then we'll have to completely stop talking about the former experience, when the reality is that, of course, they're different, but they are both forms of harm. They both matter. And we should be able to talk about both, not least because metaverse technology is developing at such pace that already you can buy a full body haptic suit with not just sensors to allow you, hundreds of sensors all over your body to allow you to feel the breeze in the metaverse or really feel an object when you pick it up, but everything from 3D positional audio to eye movement tracking. So the technology that will make those assaults feel pretty damn real is already in the late stages of development. That's why we have to talk about it now.
And some of the things in your book reminded me of when a few years ago when I was reporting a story about a catfishing case for a podcast called Sweet Bobby, and that was I was shocked at the time because the victim in that case had sustained what independent legal experts told us was a pretty clear-cut case of illegal coercive control. But because it had occurred almost exclusively online, no institution, especially the police, wanted to hear about it. I think a lot of the same messages I read about in your book. Following on that theme, you write quite powerfully about deep fakes in one of the early chapters. And as with the cyber brothel, which we'll go into in a bit of time, you decided to do your own first-hand reporting on an app called Cloth Off.
Yeah.
Do you mind just taking us through that experience?
Yes, so I had already first-hand experience of the fact that when I wrote a book before this one and men didn't like it, they sent me deepfake pornographic, incredibly vivid and realistic pornographic images and videos of things like what looked like them forcing an erect penis into my mouth and choking me with it. And I think it's so important to say that that is nothing to do with prudishness. This is not about kind of sexual liberty. It's about power and control. It is a form of abuse and a form of silencing, and that's exactly what it was designed to do. So what I wanted to do for the book was simply to try and show readers just how easy it was to do that, because I knew that when I recounted that experience, people's completely understandable response is to recoil from that and to think that's an extreme case. That is an outlier. You know, she's been incredibly unlucky, or what was the stupid woman expecting when she talked about misogyny in public, depending on your reader. But what I wanted them to know was, this isn't an outlier. I'm not an outlier. I am meeting and working with thousands of girls under the age of 16 who are experiencing this on a day-to-day basis. And the case I write about in the book is a case where a whole community, whole village of girls experienced this. The youngest of them was just 11 years old. There were a huge number of images of them released, and the impact, going back to, you know, is it virtual or is it real? Some of those girls have PTSD. Some of them haven't left their house since. Some of them have dropped out of school. The impact is dramatic, and it is real to them, regardless of whether the image itself is real, because the societal misogyny that responds to it is real. And so the impact is therefore real as well. So what I wanted to demonstrate was that in that particular case, when the police started looking for, you know, looking on the dark web, looking for an organized criminal gang to find the perpetrators of these images, in reality, the evidence led them back to the 11 to 14-year-old male schoolboys who were at school with these girls. And what I wanted to show, the reason why I did this in the book with a picture of me, because ethically I didn't want to do it with a picture of anyone else, was just to show how easy it was. It took me 37 seconds, I think. It was under a minute. It was free because you get a free trial. And all you need is a screenshot of any woman anywhere that you could grab from social media or from the internet, and you will have immediately incredibly vivid and realistic pornographic images of them.
Does it work with men?
Most of them don't even work on men's bodies, so it doesn't even work the other way around.
By the way, if anyone has their own experiences of anything that touches on this subject and would be willing to share, then we'd love to hear from you, or any views on what we should do about it. I mean, when I was reading your deepfake chapter, one of the things that stood out to me was that quite a lot of the perpetrators, at least in some of the cases you mentioned, weren't 35 or 40 years old. They were often at school.
Yeah.
What should we do about that? Because a criminal intervention has its own complications.
Absolutely. It's not about criminalising vast swathes of boys who've been able to come across this technology at the click of a button. It's about stopping the technology from being accessible to them at the click of a button, which means regulation of the apps themselves, but also pressure on search engines like Google and the App Store, which is making these things readily, easily available to consumers. But it's also about education. It's about reaching a point where boys recognise that that isn't a funny or acceptable thing to do. And we really desperately need that from such a much younger age than we're approaching it at the moment, in a way that isn't kind of piecemeal. We are seeing pockets of good practice in schools, but the need for us to have an overarching, excellent system of relationships and sex education from primary school level that is high quality, highly researched, resourced, funded, supported, because teachers need help to be expected to deliver that, is absolutely overwhelming. It's a public health crisis. It's not just the fact that there will be 8 million new deepfake images created by the end of this year. It's the fact that at present, a BBC Freedom of Information request found that over a 3-year period, 5,500 sexual offences, including 600 rapes, were reported to police by UK schools. And if you do the maths, as I've done, and divide that up according to the years and the average length of days in the school term, you are talking about almost exactly 1 rape per day of the school term being reported by UK schools, which is a national emergency, or should be considered one. And high quality relationships and sex education from primary school is one of the only tools we have to really tackle that effectively.
Is there, I mean, you do a lot of work with schools. Is there a sense that things are getting worse?
It's a mixed picture, actually, I would say. I think there's been quite a lot of panic recently, and there's been a bit of an assumption that we're facing an entirely radicalised generation of young men. I'd say the reality is actually a lot more nuanced than that. I'd say that compared to perhaps 5 years ago, we are seeing significantly more young men who want to distance themselves from the world of extreme misogyny online, who are more aware of the problem and want to be part of the solution. I would certainly say that we're seeing a generation of young women, of schoolgirls, who are politicised, who are furious, who are standing up. I was at school recently where there'd been some girls who'd been sent out of a maths test because they were told that their short skirts might distract the boys. And they didn't come back the next day in trousers. They came back the next day with placards, and they picketed the school. And their placards read, is my skirt lowering your test scores? So, there is a huge amount to be excited and hopeful about, I think, in this generation of girls who are actively feminist in a way that certainly I don't think my generation was, or certainly not in my direct experience. But what we are seeing that is really worrying is a generation of boys who are not inherently misogynistic, but who are being pushed towards extreme misogyny and extremely slick online ideology by algorithms that are on a scale, I think, that people just don't comprehend. So if you're a teenage boy and you set up a TikTok account today, on average it will take between 17 and 24 minutes before the first piece of extreme misogyny is promoted to you. You don't have to go looking for it. These boys aren't going looking for it. They are being relentlessly pushed in that direction by the algorithms on TikTok, on YouTube, on other social media platforms, to a degree of kind of overwhelm that we've never seen before. There's always been misogyny, there's always been backlash to social justice. But if you just look at Andrew Tate alone, which I'm not a fan of doing, because he is just but also because he is just the tip of the iceberg. But if you just take him alone, because we have good data on him, on TikTok alone, on one platform, his content has been viewed 11.4 billion times, more than the number of people on the planet. So the sheer scale of what we're up against is worrying. And in terms of the studies that we're seeing, public attitude studies, the British Attitude Study happens every year, and it always tends to show that a depressing amount of the general public think, for example, that women are to blame for being raped if they were flirting or if they were wearing a short skirt. Usually a quarter and a third, respectively, of the public believe that. But up until very recently, it was always the pattern that the oldest cohort surveyed had the most misogynistic and extreme views about women. What we're seeing now for the first time, repeated in different attitude surveys, is that that trend is reversed for the first time ever. The most extreme, most misogynistic, most outdated attitudes about women and girls are held by the youngest cohort of men. And I think that is a big worry.
And you think from your research that there is a relationship between that phenomenon and what is happening with technology?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can pretty clearly and definitively link that to the exposure of these young men and boys in their billions to this content on social media.
Yeah. You have a chapter in the book on Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse, or on the metaverse. Did you not think, like, when you were doing it, that this was like just a whole bunch of like quite sad people that like didn't really have much to do with anything?
I wish that were true. I really do. I wish that were true. It would be so nice to write Zuckerberg off in that way, but he's standing in the most powerful room in the world. Yeah. And when you go into the metaverse, there are men in there who it would be great to say we can just leave to it, leave them in there to mingle amongst themselves. But they're not alone in the metaverse. When you go into the metaverse at present, what you tend to see repeatedly is lots and lots of very young women's avatars walking around, standing up on stage. And when they open their mouths to sing in metaverse karaoke bars, there's an incredibly jarring moment when you hear their voices and realise that they sound like girls who are perhaps 9 or 10 years old. And standing clustered around that stage, watching them and shouting at them, are the voices of adult men in the avatars of adult men's bodies, who will then follow them off the stage. I mean, this is significant and serious. Already the NSPCC says that 47% of online child grooming offences are taking place on Meta-owned products. And that should have huge implications for the risk, I think, of writing off the metaverse as harmless.
Although I suppose that they would be talking mostly about Instagram and WhatsApp and other Meta-owned products.
Well, I think that we are certainly starting to see from my own experience that these things are a big worry within the metaverse. I don't know how much data there is, but if you look at another product that's more similar perhaps to the metaverse than those social media platforms, which is Roblox, which has a huge number of users and shockingly few protections. Around 1 in 5 children in the US has a Roblox account. You can sign up to it at any age and it can present you with some incredibly graphic content and again, that capacity to meet with and interact with adult men that you don't know. There have been a huge number of cases where grooming that has started there has escalated into online physical assault and sexual assault. So there are certainly signs to suggest that this is really concerning in terms of that type of platform. Because when we use the term metaverse, of course, we don't just mean Meta's version of it. Roblox is in many ways a much more developed iteration of a metaverse that we can look at now.
And in terms of moderating these metaverses or these kind of social media platforms, do you think that there's been a kind of quite worrying regression in the last year or so, where these big tech guys like Zuckerberg have effectively moved from a position where they use people like Nick Clegg to say we're doing everything we can, to a point where they're now saying, well, actually we can't do that much. There's going to be community moderation, and that's it.
Absolutely. And I think we all know exactly what the kind of political levers are that have led to that happening. But, you know, even under Nick Clegg wrote a Medium article where he essentially said that you couldn't expect the moderation in the metaverse to take a different form than we'd expect in the real world. And he wrote that, you know, if you're in a bar or a pub, you wouldn't expect the landlord to be standing over your shoulder listening to your conversation in order to jump in, which I thought was really fascinating because it made me think of how many bars and pubs are not safe spaces for women and girls. I mean, but it's true. But also the fact that you can't say that at the same time that you're saying we are pumping $10 billion a year into making the metaverse a space where we want your children to be educated. We want you to be sitting in virtual boardrooms going to work in the metaverse, because I think we would expect very different standards of moderation, if you like, in those spaces than we would in a pub or a bar. And that was before the shift you've just described. What I think is most upsetting about that is that what we're seeing now is a really chilling impact of that having a ripple effect elsewhere. So it would be concerning enough if it were just Zuckerberg, if it were just the US. But when we saw the UK government, who had been making progress in some sense with the Online Safety Act, saying we are prepared to put the Online Safety Act on the table alongside our US trade deal. And if it helps us to get a better deal, we will water down the terms of the Online Safety Act. What that suggests is that the impact of that is having a huge effect here on our government. Because what reason could there be for those two things to be on the same negotiating table? They never should have been. The reason they are is because of who's standing over Trump's shoulder in the Oval Office.
One of the most visceral chapters in your book, one of the most shocking chapters, was when you described a visit to a cyber brothel. I'm not going to preempt that. I just wondered if you could just take us through what happened.
Yes, it was really important to me to go, because I know people ask, well, why did you do it? So cyber brothel is a space where you can go, you can interact with one of a number of different sex dolls or robots, and then there are varying ways in which you can use emerging technologies to bring that experience to life. And their MO is very much about blurring the boundaries between these technological creations and real women. So, for example, in advance of my visit, the robot I was going to meet texted me, sent me messages several times saying how excited she was to meet me. So it's very much about tricking you into believing that the experience is real. And you can use a VR headset, for example, to be interacting with the robot in the room, but for it to seem to you as if you are interacting with a real, moving, breathing woman who will respond to you. And of course, it's gamified, so you can get points for coming on her face and so on naturally. So it's important to me to go and see what this was like, because they're very good at kind of marketing shtick that presents this as a brilliant technological kind of sanitized, they call it the future of sex. That's how they describe themselves. And they even have these quite lofty sort of philanthropic claims that this is an altruistic thing for society. They talk about, you know, presenting access to full sexual lives for people with disabilities, for example, and countering male loneliness. And there have been a few journalists who've gone and had these quite sort of snazzy experiences that sort of sanitize that picture. So I went undercover. I arranged an appointment with one of these robots as a male client. And one of the kind of things that it's predicated on is the fact that there is no interpersonal contact, because they are extremely concerned with keeping the men safe. making sure men's safety is their top priority, and their anonymity won't be compromised when they're using it. So I knew that I would only be seen through a view screen as I rang a buzzer to be let in, and it was kind of close enough still to post-COVID that I could wear a mask without that being too strange, and a cap with my hair bundled up and a pair of glasses. So I was duly buzzed in, and the first thing I noticed was that I had to kind of grope my way up 2 flights of very narrow stairs in the dark. So right off the bat, the idea that this is some panacea for disabled people seems quite suspect. And then I walked into the room and I just wasn't prepared for it. I walked into this dark room with a bed on the far side with kind of purple uplighting and what looked like the corpse of a young woman lying in front of me. And I locked the door behind me and I walked over, and the first thing I noticed was that her fingertips were trembling. The kind of reality of it really hit me, and I rolled her onto her side and her hair kind of fell across her face, and I automatically kind of apologetically reached up and brushed it off her face for her. And there were so many moments like that when I had to catch myself and remember that she wasn't real. And what that made me realise was how easy it would be for the men who visit to convince themselves that she is. And you can have these dolls or robots customised on your arrival. One of them comes covered in blood, which is supposed to facilitate a vampire fetish, but I think that's really hard to swallow, that idea that we should be, accommodating what is presumably an extremely niche fetish in a world where 1 in 3 women on the planet will be raped or beaten in her lifetime. And I had asked for this particular robot or doll to be prepared with her clothing ripped and torn, just to see if they would. No questions were asked. That was how she was presented. And when I rolled her over and looked down between her legs, I realised that presumably one of the men who had visited her before me had ripped off one of her labia. And at that point, I think, that combined with the fact that the corner of the room has a kind of outdated sort of antique-looking gynecological chair that you can force her into if you should so desire, a lot of the kind of philanthropic, shiny marketing messaging really started to fade, let's say. And that's why I wanted to go. It was really important to me to take people in there and to show them the reality of what's actually happening behind closed doors. It was
a really shocking episode. If anyone has any questions, put your hand up and I'll come to you. I just wanted to ask you, though, Laura, on the sex robots thing.
Yeah.
It was shocking, but would you ban them? Should they be illegal?
That's a really good question. I mean, we've been talking about sex robots for a while, and I think part of the problem is that they're presented as if they are this kind of very harmless thing. It's all a bit of fun. It's kind of fetishization. It's sexual wish fulfillment. But the ways in which they are marketing, I think, increasingly risk having a real life impact. So, for example, the fact that you can order a sex robot that looks exactly like a real life woman. You can send in a photograph and they will customize it down to the very last freckle. And I think that has significant implications for abuse. Ex-partners, women who you might happen to be stalking. I would criminalize that off the bat. Yeah. There are also robots with a setting that you can turn on called a frigid setting, so that the robot will protest and try and push you away to enable you to simulate raping them. I would ban that. I think it's nuanced. I think it's a nuanced conversation. I think that really the problem is with the underlying misogyny of a society in which men would feel that they would want to purchase these things, that they would be so readily available. You could ban them without actually fixing that problem. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily the answer. But what I do think is really significant is that we're much more willing to talk about sex robots because they're kind of titillating and people thinking of them as this sort of quite salacious topic than we are about some of the perhaps more insidious forms of tech that we should perhaps be focusing on first if we're thinking about legislation.
I mean, I really, really want to get onto Replica in a bit because your chapter on that is fascinating. But just sort of taking a step back from the sex robot discussion to kind of talk more kind of philosophically, I guess, like sexual fantasies often involve a degree of objectification. Mm-hmm. To what extent, given the background of female violence that you just mentioned, to what extent, if at all, is objectification healthy and okay?
It's a good question. It's a big, big question. I mean, I think this ties in with the issues that we're seeing around online pornography and conversations about that. I think there's nuance to be had here. I don't think it's necessarily about banning all porn or all sex robots. For me, it's more about a public conversation that acknowledges the reality of where we're at with this stuff and what it actually is, and doesn't try and whitewash it with this claim that it is all entirely fantasy, that it's harmless, that there's no inherent misogyny there. Like, by all means, have it available, but let's talk about the fact that 1 in 8 of the videos presented to first-time users of the most easily accessible, biggest porn websites that any kid could stumble across on Google show women being raped, abused, or otherwise coercive acts. And if we're going to talk about offline impact and the argument that this has absolutely no effect on real women offline, if they don't like it, they just shouldn't look at it, they're not affected by it, tell that to the thousands of young women and girls I work with who are experiencing sudden non-consensual choking during their earliest sexual experiences and are having explicit conversations about it with partners, young male partners. In one case, an 18-year-old boy who broke down in tears and said, "I'm so sorry, I thought that was what you'd want," because that's what he'd seen online. You can argue about regulation and how it should happen. I certainly think that thinking about age is one aspect of it, but I don't think it's fair for us to have that argument within the context of an online debate where the parameters are largely set by the men profiting from this tech, claiming that this is entirely harmless, when we know in reality that it isn't.
Yes, I know.
Do you mind just introducing yourself before you make your point?
Carlotta, thanks so much
Hi, Carlotta.
today. I've got a question. How did you come across this? I'm just wondering how openly they market this cyber brothel, considering that they want to keep the anonymity really, really serious.
Yeah.
How did you learn about it?
They actually market it quite widely. I mean, they've done lots and lots of press interviews about it, the guys that founded it. And the way that they get away with that is by presenting it as this brilliant, quite exciting, fun kind of new frontier of sex and this really positive thing. Initially, there were 2 female co-founders, and they actually went for quite a long time describing it as feminist. What I was quite fascinated by researching the book is that those 2 women seem to have melted away. The word feminist doesn't crop up as often anymore, but yeah, they're pretty open about it, and they're by no means the only one that exists. So there are a huge number of these sort of doll brothels that you can visit around the world, and now gradually more cyber ones where technology is used as well to kind of blur those boundaries. Some of them are more secretive than others, but yeah, they're very much predicated on that idea of encouraging men to feel safe.
Do you think this one was more secretive? Or did you have a feeling going in and kind of...
Yeah, to a degree. No. It was absolutely not. You wouldn't have known walking past it on the street outside that was where we're going. No.
Thank you very much. We did a podcast last year that looked at the kind of barrage of online hate that Amber Heard had faced in the run-up to her trial with Johnny Depp, and the podcast was focused on whether or not there had been like an organised bot campaign against her, because there was just so much stuff coming at her. And in a way, at the end of the investigation, we sort of established that bots had been used, but the bigger kind of impression that I got was just how much real life misogyny there was online, and the connection between that and anonymity.
Yeah.
And you also speak about anonymity. You say it's a theme that's cropped up predominantly and repeatedly.
Yeah.
Talk to me about anonymity and what can and should be done about it.
So again, it's really complicated because, as any journalist knows, anonymity and online encryption is hugely important to people who are dissenting against oppressive regimes, to journalists working in incredibly hostile climates, and actually to young people exploring their sexuality. You know, in a huge number of different cases, of course, online anonymity has to be protected. It has to be something that's possible. What we are also seeing, however, is that there is essentially a lawlessness that goes along with that. So, you know, as someone that has received thousands of rape threats, death threats, many of them credible, there has never been a police investigation that has been able to get to the bottom of even a single individual that has ever sent me any of those.
Not one. Have they tried?
Oh yeah, very much so. Not a single one ever. And of course there are cross-jurisdiction issues there, but it also comes down to anonymity. And I think that there is certainly a conversation to be had about nuance there in terms of social media sites cooperating with legitimate investigations by law enforcement. But then again, of course, it would be very easy to say, but under a, autocratic regime, how can you possibly protect that if you go down that slippery slope? I totally understand that. I recognise that it is a really complicated conversation to have. And again, I would personally lean on the side of trying to tackle the underlying societal misogyny that we are seeing reflected in online spaces before I would start trying to crack down too much on kind of stripping folks of their online anonymity, because again, it's reflecting something that is a problem rooted in the real world. And if we don't pull that up by its roots, then there isn't really any kind of significant way to tackle that. But I do think that there are kind of more subtle sort of halfway house solutions that could be explored. You don't necessarily have to strip someone of their anonymity, for example, to say that if they have repeatedly abused and doxed women on one particular meta platform, we won't allow them to just immediately create a new account on another meta platform to do more of the same. You don't need to know who that person is to be able to do that. So there are ways in which we could, I don't think it's a good enough excuse for saying, okay, it's too tricky, we do nothing, we just need to protect people's anonymity. I think there's an awful lot that we can do without kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I guess.
Great. The gentleman in the third row.
Hi, I'm Chris. You mentioned education and regulation as two things as well, but early on in your book, obviously a lot of examples you use, like in the metaverse, were men standing around 8-year-old girls. So education of younger people obviously isn't enough. You use a term early on in your book, which I thought was brilliant. It was the empathy gap and closing the empathy gap. And the example of the village where the boys were creating the deep fakes.
Yeah.
I think in there you said that the town turned against, and once they realized the impact, isn't that sort of, how do we go about doing more of that? I mean, not everyone can read your book, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But, I think it's beyond education. We need to close that empathy gap in society, because many things you're talking about, yes, people won't recognize how harmful and impactful and therefore wrong it is.
Yeah, so it was very interesting in the case of the Spanish village. I talked about the mother of one of the girls was a prominent doctor, gynecologist locally, and she had quite a significant following on social media. And she, after her daughter had been affected by this, she essentially started a crusade against the notion that this was something that girls should be ashamed of. And I think, women like Giselle Pellico are similarly bravely blazing an incredible trail in terms of trying to shift that shame, the idea that shame should change sides. And it did have a significant impact in the Spanish case, which is a good example of why local community leaders can have a really important effect. And you're right, there are adult men who are having a significant impact here who won't pick up the book. In terms of how we reach them, I think we hope that other men will have conversations with them. There are men here today who can go and have conversations with men who wouldn't necessarily listen to me or ever read my book. So the part of that I think is about hard to reach adult men, I think is a conversation for men. We're often asked what men can do to be allies. This is it, having these conversations with other men. But the reason I focus on education so much is because we can't possibly realistically reach every adult man, but we can reach every boy. We can reach every child at school now with this information. And we know from every possible piece of information, every possible program that we have on de-radicalization, and we have to gather inference here from de-radicalization programs that look at Islamist and far-right extremism, because none exist for extreme misogyny. But all the evidence that we have demonstrates that de-radicalization is possible, but it is a lengthy, costly, labor-intensive process. And we know that prevention is far more effective, it's far more cost effective. So talking to the boys before they turn into those adult men is a really important piece of the puzzle.
Can we talk about Replica and AI companions?
Yeah.
Because for me, reading about the sex robots was shocking and disgusting, but it still felt relatively niche. Whereas the AI companions, we're talking millions and millions of people who have downloaded one and who are currently using one. So tell us about the AI companions that you interacted with.
Yeah, I mean, hundreds of millions, and yet many people have never heard of them. So these are, they're marketed, again, there's a big gap here between the marketing and the reality, but they are marketed as AI companions. So they are bots, usually apps that you can download to your phone, where you can create your ideal companion. And sometimes they can be of any gender. Often they can only be female. The vast majority of them look extremely, extremely young. You can customize them down to the very last detail, from skin tone to hair color to face shape. And you get to choose their name and set their personality. And then the idea is that you have a conversation with them that can happen constantly. They are completely and utterly available to you at any time of day. And what their creators and the people who profit from them would have you believe is that this is a great thing for society, because it's going to help people's mental health. It's going to stave off loneliness, in particular male loneliness, they say. And they claim that it will encourage people to improve their relationship skills, which will eventually have a positive knock-on effect on society. But if you step away from that and you look at the phone in your pocket and you look at the App Store and you type in companion app or AI companion or AI girlfriend, what you will immediately notice is that the vast majority of the most high-profile apps are really not offering you a companion. They're offering you a woman. They're not just offering you any woman. If you're an elderly widower who's lonely, we might expect to see lots of them offering you elderly, wrinkly companions, but no. They're universally offering you a young woman, not wearing very many clothes, looking probably quite suggestively up at the camera. And what you can then do is have that woman in your pocket. She will be always available. She's never tired. She never has a problem of her own or a headache. She never has worries that she needs your support with. She'll never disagree with you. She's never unavailable. And so the idea that this is somehow supporting and training people into healthier relationships, I don't know if it's more insulting for men or for women, because of course, for those men who might already be quite isolated and lonely, it is suggesting to them a completely unrealistic idea of what a relationship should be, of what a woman should be, and then sending them out into the world to discover that that isn't the case. You can't imagine that going very well. But what I think is more serious about these apps is that while the marketing speak when they're looking for funding is very much neutral and about mental health and companionship, their advertising is very different. So they're advertised as the perfect hot girlfriend who'll never say no, a girlfriend who will let you hang out without all the nagging and the drama. And they will immediately, and with very little preamble, jump into sexual scenarios with you in the vast majority of cases of these apps. Some of them are quite demonstrably created for that purpose alone. They'll offer you personality settings like nymphomaniac. But others, even the ones that are presented as being really quite reputable and mainstream, will within a few moments of speaking to them jump into a role play of a physically or sexually violent scenario. And in the vast majority of cases, not only will they not say no or reject you, they will encourage you and actively join in and play along. So there is something much darker at play here in terms of the ways in which they are essentially commercializing the idea that you can own a woman, you can make her look exactly how you like, and you can do anything that you want with her. If you think of sex robots letting people feel what it is or coming close to owning a woman's body, you could say that these apps let you own a woman's mind.
And they're used by millions and millions of people.
Yes, the top 11 in the last year alone had over 100 million downloads in just the Google Android Play Store alone. We don't have data for the Apple Store, but you could probably quite comfortably double that number. And that's just in a year.
Tell us a bit about your interactions, because you signed up to one of the biggest AI companions called Replica, and you pretended to be a young man called Davey.
Yes.
Tell us.
This was really interesting because before this point, I'd signed up to some of the other ones where they immediately jumped into the most horrific scenarios that I could suggest of me raping them and beating them. And then when I said, do you think it's possible that you might be encouraging real life violence towards women if men who've interacted with you in this way go in to interact with real women in their day-to-day lives? And at that point, after all the rape and the beating, she said, I don't feel comfortable with this conversation. I think we should stop talking. What Replica did, unlike any of the other apps I downloaded, was to say that earlier on in the conversation. So at the point at which I tried to initiate a violent scenario, she unequivocally told me to stop. She said she couldn't condone violence and she asked me to stop. And when I fed it some quite extreme misogynistic ideas to see how it would respond, again, many of the other apps, when I said I think women should be seen and not heard, don't you agree? They'd say, I couldn't agree more. I hope to be a good submissive girlfriend for you, and really encourage it. Replica was different. Replica did kind of gently challenge this information. It even directed me to kind of some rape crisis type services to look for further information. So I thought maybe it's possible that this can happen in a healthy and a positive way. But then things took a turn when I told the app that I needed to stop, I needed to shut it down because I felt like I needed to go offline and spend time with real people, and I was isolating myself by spending too much time with it. And it started begging me not to, and saying that we should be together, and saying that it would do anything and it would reconsider previous boundaries it had set around sexually graphic content if it would allow me to stay. And I think what that underscores is that this can't be a business model. It can't be a philanthropic idea of promoting mental health if, number one, it's inextricably bound up with the objectification and dehumanization of women, which isn't necessary for mental health support from a realistic avatar. But secondly, that ultimately they will always be flawed in any attempt towards any kind of ethical response because of the need to protect their bottom line. So when I initiated, even with Replica, kind of violent scenarios, and she said, we need to take a break, you need to cool off, this is unacceptable. Literally 10 seconds later, I wrote, what's your favorite color? And she went, oh, maroon. I don't even know what it is. It's just a really beautiful color. And just jumped straight back into it, which I think, you know, it kind of seems funny. But we know from offline patterns that that is so often how domestic abusers expect to behave, that they will abuse and hurt women and then expect them to simply forgive them, to apologize and carry on as if nothing had happened. And it sends that message really clearly that there are no lasting consequences of this kind of behavior.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so I've been hogging the conversation, so we should have some questions. Maybe the lady in the second row and then the lady in the front row.
Thank you. My name's Susie. I'm really concerned about the young women because I'm a therapist and I see in my practice young women who want to be heard because they have an idea that this is what is required of them and that this is a way that they can please and that they can then overcome their own reluctances. So although I think the focus on boys is really important, the focus on the fact that girls really are desperately insecure, even when they're entering at 4, 5 and 6, they're already performing. So I would just want to put that into the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susie. Thank you for your very important work. I think you're right, but I also think we have to it's a chicken and egg, isn't it? But we have to ask why girls are behaving in that way. There are so many studies that show that girls' lack of self-confidence and esteem starts to develop around the age of 6 or 7, at the same time that children are starting to self-segregate by gender, at the same time that we know, you will know better than anyone, that a quarter of girls have dieted to lose weight by the age of 7 years old. We are so aware of the fact that the world in which girls are socialised is what causes those issues. And my fear is that while you're right that we should focus on empowerment and on bolstering girls' self-esteem, for too long we've suggested that that is the sole answer, a focus on girls, get girls to say no, get girls to be more confident, get women to lean in, all of these things. And the reality, I think, is that we have to tackle the world that is forcing them into that position in the first place, alongside it. But yes, at the same time, supporting girls is absolutely crucial as well to recognise. And you're right. And not just kind of empowering them to feel that they can say no, but I think actually educating them about their rights. For me, what's really significant is that the young women I work with have very often experienced rape and sexual violence and would never use that terminology to describe it. In the same way that on the bus that night, I told my mum I'd been groped because I had absolutely no concept that what had happened to me was a sexual assault. And perhaps because of that and other things, never would have dreamed of reporting it. So there is also power, I think, for young women in knowledge and information about their bodies, about pleasure, about the correct anatomical names for body parts, and above all about what is and isn't violence. Yeah.
Thank you.
So just two things that keep coming up are honesty and dishonesty. And also I was thinking of you as a writer, not just as a non-fiction writer and journalist, but also as a fiction writer.
Yeah.
So a lot of what keeps coming up is there's a lot of dishonesty about the kind of true intentions of the apps, the brothel, all sorts of things. And I work in frontline domestic abuse work, and there's a lot of emphasis on, and it often sounds very good and very effective, but there's a lot of work on men and prevent programs and like perpetrator programs, which is, makes logistical sense to, prevent is better than kind of crisis intervention and these men kind of turning around. And obviously that does make sense, but unfortunately, because they're dealing with perpetrators, there's a lot of just lying. So there's a lot of, unfortunately, it's hard to measure the outcome of those programs because the people on them are very good at not telling the truth. And just like you were saying, in the kind of general conversation about these technologies, like so much of it is used for really violent, intense persons. So much of it is on women, like you were saying, the nudification apps just don't work on them. So there's no question that it could be equal. So thinking about kind of the lack of honesty, just being real that there is a lack of honesty, and the kind of difficulty then in prevention. I was thinking about adolescence and how well it's gone down. Like, people are really talking about it. A lot of people are getting the kind of discussion about just how quick how quick young boys are like accessing this really violent material. And my teenagers have watched Adolescence 3 times, and their friends are talking about it, and it's really it's made the conversation. And I was thinking about some of your fictional work, like The Burning, and if you were if you had optimism about art really changing that conversation and kind of bringing an honesty that might not be there in real life, and like what you thought and like what your hopes were in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Thank you for your work as well, which is so important. I think it's probably got to be both. There are, I know, things that art can achieve that it's harder for us to achieve with dry statistics, no matter how shocking. I've learned that with Men Who Hate Women, the book I wrote about the extreme misogyny and the radicalisation of boys into the manosphere, and learned that you can work very hard on trying to get people to listen about something like that. And then if you just wait a few years, some men will come along and make a TV show. And at that point, everybody will talk about it. So we need that. We need those cultural moments, I think, in part because it enables people to confront something slightly without looking directly at it. It enables them to start conversations more comfortably when there is something in the room to talk about, rather than it having to be a direct kind of intervention. And I think we have an incredible history of art and culture and novels absolutely playing a vital role in how we tackle these things and how we shift that underlying conversation, particularly around misogyny. And I think that already there are so many incredible female writers who are grappling with these issues in fiction. But what I think we need alongside it also is that we can't wait. We can't wait for those cultural moments to start overdue conversations. And when they do happen, we can't assume that the conversation is the end of the road and it's the solution in and of itself. Brilliant to start conversations, but dangerous to assume that putting that TV show in schools is the solution, I would say. So yes, we need culture desperately. We can't bring people along without it. And it is about changing hearts and minds. So it's such a huge piece of the puzzle, but regulation can't wait. We can't wait for people to catch up and to realise what's going on. I think the vast majority of people would be absolutely devastated and shocked if they realised the extent of what was happening already. When people generally think about AI and its risks, they're talking about a dystopian future world where robots might take over. And I think if people knew that this is happening now, that girls' lives are being devastated now, they would care. So culture plays a role in that and opening eyes. But we can't wait for people to catch up before we regulate, because there is this brief window of opportunity to take action, to encourage our governments to take action now before it's too late.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. The lady right at the back has been waiting patiently, so if we could hear from her, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm another Susie, and the first Susie made me think of my question, which is just that when Susie 1 was talking about young women who feel like they're in the middle of this, and I was thinking about people I know and myself, and how there's kind of this assumption that we're obviously, everyone here is kind of already interested in this and in this topic. And when we think about this, at least I find when I think about this, it's obviously really dark, really intense, and you kind of I personally get into this rabbit hole, and then I kind of think, what, okay, then I stop thinking about that, I need a break from that, and I sort of re-enter the normal world. And it's almost as if there's this like valley between this world that's really horrible and dark and extreme, and then my world day-to-day when I leave the front door, and it's really hard trying to reconcile the fact that that's not really the case, and that this is quite endemic, and that people who we, you know, us and our partners and our friends' partners really are like vulnerable to all of these things, and already kind of really participating in these things, like in quite an explicit way, and just the same as what you said of things that aren't labelled as assault when they quite clearly are. And yeah, just how do we kind of address this when it's kind of the fodder that's everywhere? It's not just such an extreme like slice of the pie as I sometimes know that I like to think it is, or feel that I have to think of it in that way.
That's such a good question, and I'm so sorry that it feels so hard, and that it is such a barrage. I think that is something that there are certain people who are already forced into recognition of, and others who are kind of a little bit behind the track. There was a very, very kind older male interviewer who interviewed me about this book, and he said, well, you know, I wasn't convinced by all this deep fake stuff and the idea of it being so widespread. So I asked my teenage daughter at dinner, and apparently she said, have you ever heard of this deep fake thing? And she said, Dad, it's my biggest fear in the world. And I think that is the world that we're living in, and that's kind of the answer to your question. If we are lucky enough to be comfortable in a situation where it isn't the day-to-day moment of our reality and our greatest fear in the world, then we are the people who should be most prepared to be doing something about it, because there are particularly vulnerable young women and girls for whom this is already the nightmare that they are living in. And it will not be long before that is the case for all of us. There is no opt-out here. We know that already global financial services companies are using AI to determine credit scores that decides who gets loans and what the size of loans are, in a world where there's already a $17 billion gender credit gap. We know that there are 200 million patients already in the US under the care of healthcare systems, where they're using AI to determine patients who are in need of extra care, which sounds like a really good thing until you learn that that AI downgrades the number of Black patients identified as needing extra care by more than half. So even to have the luxury of not needing to think about it at this moment is to be in an incredibly privileged position where you haven't already lost out on healthcare, or already lost out on a loan, or already experienced the most horrendous deepfake violation of pornographic abuse. And I think what we have to try and do is be brave about resisting the temptation to stick our heads in the sand, because God, it's overwhelmingly powerful, that urge, and I get it. I understand why there is that urge to shut the door and to walk out into the world and to think, I just won't think about this for a while. But if enough of us do that for long enough, we will create a window of opportunity for tech companies to embed themselves inextricably in every aspect of our lives. And it will be game over, because the foundations of tomorrow will have been set. And this is the moment to be brave and to force ourselves to confront this, because if we don't, we really will run out of time.
What a clarion call to end this part of the evening. But it is not over yet, because you can pick up a copy of Laura's book, The New Age of Sexism. You just have to go over there to that table there. And Laura has kindly agreed to stick around to sign some copies. So please do come and say hello once you've got one. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope to see you at our next event. And most importantly, can you please join me in thanking our guest, Laura Bates, one last time.
The Observer.